You're watching the News Hour with Arnab Goswami from the RT studios in Moscow.
The role of Russia in the war against the Islamic State has been debated by the West extensively. Why is the West cagey about Putin's intervention? So far, there's been just one narrative that the world has largely been fed about a friend of Bashar al-Assad joining the Syrian coalition in bombing key Islamic State targets. But is that the last word? What's the Russian point of view? Why is there a need for an alternative view in times of a global conflict? India's most watched news show traveled to Moscow to find out. In this Moscow edition of the News Hour, Times Now editor-in-chief Arnab Goswami speaks to a renowned global panel in association with global broadcaster Russia Today to debate the need for an alternative view in times of a global conflict.
You're watching the News Hour with Arnab Goswami from the RT studios in Moscow.
Hello and welcome to this special show that we are shooting here in the RT studios. It's a collaboration between Russia Today and Times Now, and it's very nice for Russia Today to allow us to use their studios for this chat. And with me is the very popular host of RT's Crosstalk show, Peter Lavelle. Peter, thank you for having us over.
It's great to be here with you.
Yeah, looking forward to a chat, an open chat about an issue that's very relevant today. So what we are going to be talking about today is broadly about the global conflict that's going on in the Middle East, the consequences of that and what can be done about it. And we have a very distinguished panel. Let me quickly introduce all our panelists. And to my right, I have Peter Kuznick. He's director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. Very strong on anti-war efforts and a very distinguished foreign policy commentator. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you for having us over. So Rockey Anderson is with us. He's a well-known attorney and an American politician. And Rockey was the presidential candidate of the Justice Party. Was that in 2012? Rockey?
Yes, it was.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And to Rockey's right is Vadim Kozyulin. He's a senior researcher at PIR, which is a think tank. And your area of speciality is Central Asia.
And international conflicts.
And international conflict. And you're also professor of the Academy of Military Sciences.
Exactly.
That's great to have your perspective from a Russian point of view. How do you view things? It'll be great to get your point of view. And also with us is Roman Kosarev. Roman is a correspondent and presenter at RT. And he will bring a different perspective, Peter, to the conversation today because till recently, he was reporting out there on the front lines. And I think it was around the Syrian-Turkish border that you survived an attack.
That's right. It was a rocket attack about 20 kilometers away from Syria-Turkey border. But, thankfully, we are here today. Well, it's good to be here.
Well, fantastic.
It's very interesting because when we have this kind of from the very intellectual perspective all the way down to the ground here in this panel, which is really important here. I think it's really interesting that what's happened in the last few months is when you had Russia's invited intervention into Syria by the government here, and it's changed the parameters of this conflict considerably so, because it's really kind of forcing the issue of what does the West want, particularly the United States. Does it want to end this civil war? Or is it remaining with its policy that Assad must go? What goes after Assad, no one has really told us here. We can surmise what will happen, maybe the black flag, and then you would have a terrorist state in the center of the region here. But Russia's intervention has really forced this issue because it really begs the question, is that why did France and Britain need to find themselves giving themselves permission to go bombing a sovereign country after Russia had done it. Russia had got all of its ducks lined up diplomatically, talked to all of the countries in the region, even countries that they don't even have the best relations with. But they laid out a plan. This is what we're going to do because we're going to fight and destroy terrorist groups inside of Syria and only inside of Syria because that was their mandate under international law here. That has not really sunk in, or maybe to the degree that there's a lot of voices in the powers, the corridors of power in the West that just don't want to see Russia succeed because there is some success on the ground.
Yeah, that's right. Peter, it's so interesting you say that. because I think it's for the first time since the Cold War that America's point of view is actually being challenged. You look at the situation in 2015 compared to the situation in 2003, nobody questioned the whole weapons of mass destruction theory. You just went into Iraq and you did what you wanted to, and then you did the analysis later of the so-called unintended consequences. You can't do that anymore because of the Russian involvement.
You know, maybe this is the way we could kind of start off this discussion here, is if we look at what Vladimir Putin had to say to the General Assembly of the United Nations just days before Russia's intervention, legal intervention into Syria. And he's just basically asked or made an observation. He says, look what you have done. Now, we can go from one intervention to the next, and there are differences, different degrees of outcomes here, but all of them are catastrophes. If we look at Iraq, if we look at Afghanistan, if we look at Libya, we could say Ukraine, maybe Ron, we could talk a little bit about Ukraine because he was there as well, and then we have Syria. The outcomes are all the same.
Go
ahead,
But the United States going it alone or with a few of their allies has been an unmitigated disaster. And what we're not hearing enough of is a demand that the United Nations take a lead role and bring the international community together. And it can't be the United States saying, oh no, we're not going to have Iran help us defeat ISIS. Or we're not going to partner up with Russia to defeat our common enemy. I don't understand it. During World War II, we had anti-communists in power in the United States, and we found great allies, the most powerful ally possible, to help us defeat the enemy during World War II. And it's doing a disservice to everyone. How President Obama can call up anyone to engage in Syria right now against ISIS or ISIL without teaming up with those who can help in the effort. I think
let's make it very clear to our viewers here, very clear to our viewers, is that there are two competing coalitions, more or less, if we look at Syria. And one coalition is led by the Syrian government in conjunction with Iran, with Hezbollah, and now with Russia. That's the mean and lean group. And then we have the 65 other countries with Mr. Obama here. But the first coalition I mentioned, they're the ones that are actually doing the heavy lifting. They're the ones that are taking losses. I mean, the Syrian army, for all the talk about Assad being a butcher, if you look at the casualties, half of those casualties have fought for the government in Damascus. These are soldiers. These are civil servants. Everyone associated with this regime. This is what a civil war is all about. Peter, what is it? Is it just a bad habit? You can't break the bad habit, from what Rockey had to say? I mean, logic dictates, but where is the logic?
Well, Rockey was making a very important point about the fact that we have been able to form coalitions in the past, alliances. That's why we like to look back to World War II as the model. We just celebrated the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. And the United States and Russia were allies. We had different systems, different ideologies, different interests in some ways, but the interests coalesced. And in 1942, President Roosevelt said in the post-war period, what we're going to need is 4 policemen. And his vision was that the United States and the Soviet Union and Britain and China were going to provide peace and stability and security in the world. We've gotten away from that. The Cold War was all about different kinds of divisions, and the Americans and the Soviets became enemies during that period. What people are talking about, what Rocky's talking about, what I've been talking about, is the possibility of revisioning the world, of seeing the world as potential alliances along different lines. But there are a lot of forces, because you have to go back to, well, we can go back to a lot of periods, but let's go back to 1992, with the end of the Soviet Union, when America's neocons, before the Bush administration, talked for the defense planning guidance, which was a Pentagon strategy. And what they announced was that the United States now has a unipolar moment, that the United States no longer has an enemy that can challenge us. And so this is our chance to really run the table. We can assert ourselves, do whatever we want, anywhere in the world. And the United States began to completely ignore Russian interests. We expanded NATO 12 more countries. Now we're talking about Montenegro for a 13th country.
How that's going to add to the security of NATO is a mystery.
I think it's going to really make us safe now.
Really make it safe.
But Peter, that applied in that time. I think what America is failing to realize that's dealing with a very different situation. You're not even dealing with a government. You're dealing essentially with a terror group when you're talking about the ISIS. I think that would change the rules of the game. And maybe, because this conflict, there is a real danger that this conflict may not remain a limited conflict in the region. As people have said, the ISIS can just spread anywhere. It's a fanatic point of view. It's a fanatic philosophy, if you may call it that. So,
but we've always defined our enemies as fanatics in that way. We go back to World War II again. We look at U.S. propaganda about Japan during World War II.
Absolutely.
And about the Japanese that pretend they're chopping people's heads off. Right? Our enemies are always chopping people's heads off. It's like, if we don't do it with our drones.
And ever since the Second World War, all of our enemies are Hitler.
No, but you understood. I mean, let me play devil's advocate here. Americans understood who they were dealing with. They even understood who Gaddafi was. They knew who Saddam Hussein was. They knew how to handle them. They had a role in propping them up at one point of time. In the case of the ISIS, it appears to a lot of observers of what's happening in the Middle East is that America is not completely in control of the situation. It doesn't know how to handle this particular force, which is not just a physical force, but also a...
But it's very interesting, gentlemen, because, ISIS is not a state, and you're absolutely right. But there's kind of a juxtaposition here, is because ISIS is not a state, we've seen the U.S. and its allies completely ignore sovereign rights all across the board in this region here. And so when we really need sovereignty to come into play, it's not there. I mean, the example of the Russian jet being shot down over Syrian airspace. So Russia, quote unquote, violated Turkey's airspace, but that plane went down as a result of Turkey violating Syria's sovereignty here. So it's one of the interesting things. You have all of these parallel elements here. You have good terrorists, bad terrorists. You have good sovereignty, bad sovereignty. And it's because of bad actors in the international system, and the United States is leading the role because it plays this exceptional role. The rules don't apply. Now, inside the American bubble, it works. No one questions it. But more and more outside of the bubble, people do.
Now, the point is, and I think I'd like to take that forward with Vadim, the point is, Vadim, is that so far, and you mentioned the 1992 moment, it was a unipolar world. The American point of view is being challenged. Who is a good terrorist? Who is a bad terrorist? Someone who serves you strategically becomes a good terrorist, as opposed to a bad terrorist. In this case, this American obsession with Assad, it's clearly diluted the fight against the Islamic State. What do you think, Vadim?
It's interesting that you mentioned that we are fighting not a state. We are fighting, I would say, idea. Because ISIS, it's mainly idea, it's not a state. And it's ideology, which is not easy to kill. It's possible to kill a person with these ideas, but it's not easy to kill communism, especially such doctrinized, Islamic State ideology. There are many similarities between communist idea and ISIS idea, and it has grabbing potential among young people. It is supported by some verses from Quran. And last week I came from Afghanistan. It's interesting to learn that young people there, they learn these ideas right in their school, sponsored by foreign community.
Well, the Gulf countries, let's be very clear about where it comes from.
Absolutely.
It's extracurriculum activity organized by different parties like Jaish Islam or Hizb ut-Tahrir. After the school time is over, young people, those who are looking for the future, who are looking for...
Yeah, but Vladimir, I agree with you, but I guess, why do we get to this situation here? Because what we have is failed governance. What we have elites that have been installed after the First World War, after the Second World War, maintained or changed after the end of the Cold War. This is bad governance, and people on the ground are recognizing this. Look at the situation in Iraq, when you have a religious minority having majority power. I mean, that was done intentionally, okay, divide and conquer. We see it all the way across the Middle East, and it was particularly after the First World War that was intentionally done.
Yeah,
but
that abuse was allowed by the Americans.
Was
promoted and
legitimized
by the
aggressive,
Americans. Yeah.
You know, then it no longer seems like a minority, because I've seen it in Ukraine, I've seen it in Syria as well. You can say all over the world. Once minority becomes armed and aggressive
and in power,
that's it. The people want to live in peace. You know, it's natural for a human being to want to live in peace. But unfortunately, once they got a gun held to their head, they can no longer live in that peace.
So you've reported in the region specifically, and that's what Peter and I wanted to draw you out on. Mm-hmm. Everyone says this is what the people of Syria want.
Yeah.
No.
Right? This is, I mean, it's not America's obsession with Assad almost decided that Assad is the bad guy.
Do you know the language that terrorists speak?
Pardon?
Do you know the language that terrorists speak? They speak English, they speak Russian, they speak English in various accents, including American, including English, including Indian. You know, it's terrorism. It's international. You know, you cannot point to Bashar Assad, you cannot point to Syria, you cannot point to, I don't know, Kuwait or Iraq or whatever country and say this is where terrorists live. Because terrorists, you know, people, you will always have war hawks, no matter what, in the world. And you'll always have people that, you know, like to pick up a gun and go shoot somebody.
When they're given an opportunity.
We should make sure we're using the right terms.
Yeah.
I mean, terrorism is a tactic.
Yeah, it's international.
Right? But it's a tactic.
Mm-hmm.
And people without power have always used terrorism as a tactic.
Right.
Right? So I think we have to differentiate between terrorism, the tactic, when that's the huge mistake that Bush made, declaring a war on terrorism. You know, you don't want to declare a war on a tactic.
Yeah,
and so what we need to do is get at the roots of these people's alienation. Why would people, decent human beings to begin with, adopt this kind of tactic where they're so indifferent to human suffering?
You know, it's so much easier to buy a tank and a plane and a gun than to go to the deep where you want to go about alienation.
But the way we're going to solve these problems is not by having better guns and more tanks and better bombers.
Maybe a few schools and a few hospitals might change.
And you look, for example, in Afghanistan, was it 2011? The United States spent $110 billion on fighting, on military, and $2 billion on sustainable development.
There you go.
So it's a question of priorities. And so desperate people are always going to turn toward the tactics that they need. Now, this group is particularly horrific in the things that because they celebrate the violent aspects. And in other ways, it's difficult.
But who do they represent? You know, at the end of the day, who do they represent? As he says, they're a mix of nationalities. They're a bunch of mercenaries who use whatever. They're a bunch of mercenaries who use whatever American hardware is left behind, along with this fanatic ideology.
Accidentally given to them. My goodness, gentlemen. If you look at this conflict, it's one of those rare conflicts in history where everybody across the board is using exactly the same equipment.
Where was the missile made that hit you?
Well, I'm not sure where it was made. I don't know which
what kind is it,
but on it said in English, motor launch vehicle. It showed temperatures in Fahrenheit.
It was American.
That's American.
So,
So then,
who else uses
can we go to the root issue?
Yeah, I think the root issue, and we started off maybe on the wrong tack, because I think the first step is joining together under the aegis of the United Nations. Never the United States going it alone again, not calling the shots, not driving away people because of other political differences, not saying, Russia, you're not invited to our party, Iran, you'd be a good partner here as you were in the beginning of Afghanistan, but we're not going to play with you either. But we're not this battle just going toe-to-toe. This isn't against just another state, although that would help. But what I was going to get at is in doing this, and we need a common strategy among all these nations. How are we going to stop feeding the recruitment and providing more of what these people who are attracted to ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the rest?
I like the point which was mentioned by Peter. ISIS, its idea of violent jihad, and that's the target. Not ISIS the target, not terrorists the target. Probably ISIS will exist once they say, yes, we are modest, a modest Islam adherers. We want to learn Sharia, but we don't spread it by arms. And it's also very important to note that today, that's what I know from my sources, there is a huge marketing race in the world arms market. Mm-hmm. Everybody is trying to buy something, and a lot of others are dwelling over the world, especially in the former Soviet republics. Mm-hmm. And the end user are usually modest European countries like Qatar, Saudi Arabia,
well, there's
Arab
nothing
Emirates.
modern about them, okay? But what I find problematic about the war on terror, the new war on terror, the war on ISIS, ISIL, I don't see Western powers serious about it. Rhetorically, they may be serious
I
about
agree
it.
with you.
After Paris, everybody goes on Facebook and changes their profile and things like that. It doesn't change anything. Because I truly believe that they're interested in the U.S. They think they can control ISIS. They're a tool, not to be destroyed, but to be used. That's what bothers me.
Peter, I agree with you. I think there's a lack of seriousness because you have not gone to the root, and that's what I was addressing with Rockey. There is a short-term problem, there is a medium-term problem, and there's also a long-term problem. The short-term problem is ISIS. How do you deal and exterminate ISIS? The medium-term problem is to get the world together to agree on Assad. They'll have to sit together at the table. The long-term problem, and this might be controversial, the long-term problem is the United States of America. Well, I mean, Obama said in an interview to Vice that the whole business of unintended consequences, that, ISIL is a direct outgrowth of the Al-Qaeda, which is a consequence of our, unintended consequences.
Well, I think it's an outcome of the illegal invasion and occupation of
I'd like to trace it back a little further than that.
So just I'll put that question to you. So if the major problem is America, and America is not sure how it's going to handle itself and its own foreign policy in the short term, then what's the point of taking on ISIS today? Because ISIS needs America to continue. ISIS needs this American intervention across the world.
They both need each other.
So they feed off each other.
Yes.
So ISIS and America, in a way, directly feed off each other. But America is blind to the issue, Peter.
Well, America's been blind to a lot of issues for a long time, as has much of the rest of the world. But in terms of this crisis, I would trace the roots of it back even further than Peter was. I trace it back to Afghanistan.
Yeah, agreed.
Because in April of '78, when the pro-Russian government took over in Afghanistan, the United States immediately began devising a policy to support the rebels, the Mujahideen. And it was Brzezinski. Initially, Carter resisted that. Yeah. But Brzezinski was completely intent on this, and he finally persuaded Carter. And Brzezinski writes that on July 3rd, 1979, when Carter signed the document to give arms and training to the opposition in Afghanistan. Yes. He said, I sent Carter a note that day saying this is going to force a Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And so even though publicly the United States said this is horrible, look what the Soviets are doing, privately Brzezinski was rejoicing. He said, we've given the Soviets their own Vietnam. And then we started supporting the extremists, the crazies,
and
the
we have never looked back. We've never looked back.
Not only did we also trained them, they were being trained with books that were being printed at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, that were training them in jihad. So we deliberately created these jihadis, or did what we could to foster them and support them and train them and educate them. And then the Taliban began to use American documents in order to train their people in jihad.
If you want to go back.
No, but it's important you go back because America felt that it could handle this sort of these theocratic, repressive governments / groups in whichever way possible. So I go back to my question. If the third part of the triangle is the United States of America, is getting the United Nations in a worthwhile way of handling the US? Will the US listen to the UN? And if obviously they won't because the UN doesn't have that kind of clout, then who's going to get America to change its long-term foreign policy?
The problem is when you get to, you have to face catastrophic failure. That's the only thing that's going to happen.
But they have faced...
Because, if you look, my fellow Americans on the panel, America lives in its own world, all by itself.
But that's no longer true, though. That might have been true. It's becoming less and less true.
It's less and less true, but it's still remarkably disturbing. Peter, when you look at the... I have to hold my my lunch when I watch these Republican debates, okay? Because this is empire gone to the extreme. I mean, this is end times. I mean, listening to Lindsey Graham and people like that. I mean, this is lunacy. This lunatic politics now, okay? Because the more it fails, the more they push it, the more they double down.
Exactly, precisely.
Look at Trump now. His comments about not allowing any Muslims into the United States. A lot of people agree, but do they understand how much this is fueling the recruitment into these organizations?
But Rocky, what Peter...
No, but we go full circle, Peter. That's what I'm trying to say.
Rocky, what the point that Peter's making is an interesting point because he's making a point about American hubris. Yeah. I do not think... I don't know if you agree with me. I think America thinks that the problem of the Islamic State is because they left Iraq too early.
Oh, well,
not because they went into Iraq in the first place.
Talking points, of course.
That's hubris, right?
Yes, right?
That's hubris. Right. So they actually think it's because they went out of Iraq that the situation got out of hand.
But again, I always stick with the facts, folks. It's the Iraqi government that asked the U.S. government to leave. Let's remember,
and it was actually Bush who signed the agreement that we had to leave, but we did.
So,
this was not
Obama's taking some kind of... No, but this gets to the whole root problem here, gentlemen, is that these countries, these people, are never given agency. They're always the subject of someone else's power and interests. Look at all of the borders. They're all artificial here. Now, I had a guest on my program from the Brookings Institution, and they have come up with an idea of partitioning. Now, on one level, it makes sense because it could end the Civil War. But again, it is Western powers. Almost exactly 100 years ago it happened, and there's a repeat again. Well, somebody in an air-conditioned office in Washington, D.C., decides who lives on one side or the other of the line here. This is not making any progress. It's not recognizing the agency of these people, and it's no wonder that some of these people turn to these radical groups here where they do feel agency. Unfortunately, gentlemen, in this century and all centuries, being able to kill someone gives some people a sense of agency. That's a sad state of affairs.
Yeah, so I just want to, let's go back to the subject at hand right now as a moment, is what are you going to do in Syria? How are you going to get together? Is there genuinely, do you believe from a Russian perspective, for example, that there is the seriousness of both sides to strike an agreement, or do they hope that it's simply bombing the place selectively?
Syria's been at war since 2011, and the Syrian army is seriously depleted at the moment. So, any help that the country can get would be advantageous for the people. I've been to not just the Russian air base, but I traveled around the country a little bit. I went to Homs in Latakia, and you could see that, obviously, we don't look anything like the locals, and they could see that we were foreigners, and we had people coming up to us and saying, "Thank you, Russia. Please say hello to President Putin and tell him thank you for everything." At one point I thought my arm would get ripped off, and people pulling me back and forth wanted to kiss me and take a selfie with me and say...
Is that a skewed perspective? Because, I'm not saying get taken with the Western propaganda, because I know the Americans have turned a blind eye to others using chemical weapons in the past, but they haven't been vis-a-vis Assad. But just asking you, as a journalist, did you feel that's a skewed perspective? Does anyone talk to you about the Assad regime's own excesses against its own citizens and question why Russia...
I wish I could speak to somebody like that, but I didn't have a chance to do that. Places that I would go to were government-controlled, and everywhere I would turn, people would express their support for the government and for Bashar Assad. I could see Assad's pictures of him or his dad everywhere, and I could see with the people, it was quite genuine with their support, because they would voice their support for Assad along with Putin, with the president, and this is what
I think I know why. I think I know why. And the best outcome would be that all players get together and we wind down this civil war.
Yes. Yeah,
but it's not going to happen, gentlemen.
One thing
let me finish the point. This is not going to happen. And that's why Russia has intervened. Because there is a military solution.
For how long has
there
Russia
is a military solution to this war. There is. With Russian air cover, with Iranian help, with Hezbollah, the major players, the depleted army that Roman just mentioned, get them out of the sovereign borders, beyond the sovereign borders of Syria. That's one step. This is one of the reasons why the Russians, it's a calculated risk and a big risk. And I've been saying this from day one. This is not risk-free for the Russians. We've seen what the Americans will do. We'll trip them up every step of the way, even to the point of assisting the Turks to shoot down a Russian plane. Okay. There is a solution to it this way. It's rough, and it will take time, but it can work. Go ahead.
No, I just, looking at the situation, I had two questions which I wanted to put. A, in your view, how far is President Putin looking? Is he looking 6 months from now? Is he looking 1 year from now? And obviously, I would think, looking at it from an Indian subcontinental perspective, that having been wounded in Afghanistan, does Russia want to get involved in long-term engagement on foreign soil, which may have different consequences for the Russian government? What do you think?
I think that the strategy was for a short term, just to gain strong power in the capital of Syria, and to get everybody around the table, all parties involved, and to get peace. I guess that the general movement is exactly in this direction. France has joined already. Germany is gradually joining, or it looks like that. Obama has no definite strategy. I would say that he has no strategy in the Middle East, and he's criticized not only in Europe but in the United States as well.
On that, I think everyone across the table will roundly agree with you.
So probably the agreement is not so far. And once everybody understands that the target is violent jihadist, and the purpose number one is to stop civil war, then it's understandable what we have to do.
But is that the goal? See, this is what really bothers me, because we have major powers. I'm looking at Saudi Arabia. I'm looking at Turkey. There's an interest in keeping that boiling right there. Look, the sovereign government of Iraq has demanded that Turkey remove its troops and trainers from the northern part of the country on deaf ears, okay? The Americans embarrassed themselves publicly on how to spin that, because there is no spin to it whatsoever. You have a NATO country invading illegally what was an American ally. You have now you have Iraq that is, remarkably so, is going to be joining the Russian coalition slowly but surely here. No, there will be no outcome to this war unless you have the American coalition where they get all on the same side and work towards what they want. Because the Syrian coalition knows exactly what they want to do, and they're trying to get there to getting rid of all of these terrorist groups within the sovereign state of Syria. That's a pretty simple plan. It won't be easy to achieve. But if you look at the American coalition, everybody is against everybody. They all have their own interests, and we see the Americans and the Turks butting into each other because of the Kurdish issue, and I can go on and on and on. So this is the problem here. The West doesn't know what it wants.
Yes, that's true. But we go back to your second point you said, and that was figuring out a way for everybody to agree on how to replace Assad. Yeah. Now, if we want to outflank the U.S. policy on this, the thing that Putin should do is agree much more openly and decisively, saying that this is a necessary step once we've established some stability there, to have, as he has said to some extent, that the Syrian people themselves are going to have to make a decision about that. But I think the more we emphasize that as an essential ingredient of this, then we're going to force the American hand into working with the Russians. The one thing that's holding them back, especially in terms of U.S. politics right now, is this idea of Assad. And because Assad, I mean, we don't want to give Assad here a blank check, and we don't want to whitewash his behavior. Nor do we want, but again, to put it in a little more historical perspective, Syria is not really an aberration. If we go back to the early 2000s in the United States, and you look what Wesley Clark met with a top official at the Pentagon, and this guy said, we have a plan to get rid of seven governments, right? And one of them was Syria. But all the, whether it was Bolton or other American leaders at the time, or ideologues like Podhoretz, they all included Syria as a government that the United States wanted to topple, or at least the neocons wanted to topple. So the fact that this is happening in Syria, again, is part of a broader plan. You know, that we've seen the effects of it.
If I may, you know, a contrary perspective would be that I think the Americans have got sentimentally involved with the rebels who want to topple Assad. And having invested so much in them, politically, strategically, militarily, and economically, the Americans don't know how to pull back. I think one solution, and that's what Putin probably realizes, so he might just target the rebels in the short term, saying once we've dealt with the rebels, then we will get into a negotiation on what to do with Syria.
But I think it's a mistake to talk about them in terms of being rebels. Most of these are outsiders. Most of them are mercenaries.
Agreed.
These are not people internally who are fighting to overthrow their own government.
So Americans have got involved with them, whatever you call them, you know, rebels or mercenaries. Americans have got involved. They don't know how to pull back because they have overcommitted themselves to supporting these people. So the problem may be, instead of talking about Assad, maybe Americans and the American coalition should sit together and talk about whether it's time to pull back from these people.
We're only hearing one narrative, though, in the United States.
Yes. Of course.
We're only hearing that Assad needs to go, and we need to support those people that Obama calls the moderate rebels.
Peter likes to speak about history, and he's absolutely right, because when we look at the American propaganda machine in action, all of the woes of the Middle East, and now the migrant refugee problem in Europe, it's all Assad's fault. There's no chronology here. There's no sense of causality here. There's no context here at all. And most importantly, gentlemen, there's never any moral responsibility taken for actions here. And this is what's really again, you know, what's going to take for a big change? And I'm very deeply pessimistic.
But we're all pessimistic about the changing internally in the United States. And the question becomes, I think, what do other international actors do in order to change the narrative and force the U.S. hand?
Well, I think
and then the question becomes, what does Putin do to put Obama in a position that he can't refuse? You know, so
no, but see, this plays
into terrorists to show them TV.
Yeah, but see, this is one of the interesting things, because this is again how the propaganda machine works. We all know the difficult relationship that Russia and the United States have had, Russia and its American allies, because of Ukraine. And now, what does this mean? I remember it as clear as a bell. Now Russia has invaded Syria. That was the narrative. Russia has invaded Syria. It shows, you know, their evil intents here. So you know, you can't. There's no one in the U.S. that will be given any voice to giving an alternative narrative. How it's a positive move. As a matter of fact, how in American media can actually say, and I'll say it on this program here, and it will be heard by people, is that the best person to have in Syria right now is Assad. Okay, if you like him or not, all right, he is a sense of stability right now, because no one can convince me they know the future after he leaves and that regime collapses. No one knows, and I don't want to go there. I don't even want to speculate.
Didn't we see that in Libya, and didn't we see that in Iraq?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So what we have here is, I think Putin served a purpose. The situation is very convoluted now. And let me therefore politely disagree with you on that. Politely disagree.
Politely.
The operational word is politely. The point is that given the convoluted situation right now, we are talking about global power play instead of talking about what to do with the Islamic State. And I think this is exactly the situation that would allow the Islamic State to flourish. I mean, I agree with you. And I began the discussion also by saying American point of view, America is part of the problem. It needs to be challenged. But this situation is allowing the Islamic State to flourish for longer than it should.
The U.S. doesn't have control of its coalition partners.
Is that the issue?
No, it's really one of the interesting things if you look as a backdrop to the civil war in Syria. Let's take a look at Yemen and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia right now, over the last few years, has had a very assertive foreign policy, which we haven't seen before. And Washington can't control them. As a matter of fact, if you look at one of the largest air forces in the world is in Saudi Arabia, but do they use their planes against ISIS in Syria? No, they don't. They bomb one of the poorest countries in the world with American help. Americans provide them with intelligence.
Not just intelligence. The United States is providing $100 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia.
Five-year deal, yep.
Obama is actually providing twice as much military aid and arms sales to Saudi Arabia as Bush did.
So when you say allies, you actually mean Saudi Arabia?
I mean
Saudi Arabia and Turkey.
I mean Turkey.
And the Emirates.
But see, if you look at Turkey, maybe one day the historical record will be open. We'll go to the archives and we'll find out really what degrees is a wag the dog situation here, because the Americans need the Turks in terms of Pakistan and other places, very much so. What kind of leverage they have, it's still very unclear to me. We have a very in my opinion, a very weak foreign policy team in Washington, to the point of, I think they're just letting the clock run out here, because this administration is completely spent.
So then if this situation is helping the ISIS, how long can this situation continue? How long will people in conferences in Moscow and Washington and elsewhere discuss how to get over the present problem? One thing is very clear, the airstrikes alone have not been good enough to repel the ISIS from the areas that they have captured.
They can control it. They can contain it to some extent, which they're doing.
So how long is this strategy?
If you ever want to go after somebody, where do you go? You go to their heart, you go to their mind. No, you go to their wallet.
Yes, we can do that.
Go to their wallet.
Yeah. Okay. And that's increasingly a discussion in the United States, too, now. The question of what role is Turkey playing? And who's facilitating the sale of that oil that the ISIS has?
Now we are.
And so there is more of a discussion of that. People are becoming more aware.
Only because the Russians...
Right, but so we got to build on that. That's the point I'm trying to make, is build on the Russian initiative, build on Putin's role, build on Putin's heightened credibility, and to think, how can he force the United States now to do the right thing? Because it's not happening in Turkey.
It doesn't fit in with the narrative of Russian aggression,
No, I think that's
hard to do that.
But that's the point, because there are two options now. Airstrikes are not working. Now, either you have boots on the ground, which I think is going to complicate the situation further. Much more boots on the ground, much more forces. Or, as he says, cut the economic tap to the Islamic State.
And Obama doesn't want to go there either.
I would start from different perspective. First, stop the arms flow. Here is a huge arms flow, and the demand is very high. That's what I notice myself. Second, oil industry. It still functions there. We had the same situation in Chechnya.
That's right.
The country or the region was in ruins, but the industry works perfectly.
And really good refining of oil.
It continues working today as well. We cannot destroy it completely as far as winter is coming, and the population need oil, and it's a part of their income, on the other hand. But at least export of oil can be stopped. Money flow inside the region has to be stopped. So the solution is quite visible. And once we agree on that openly at the air, then probably the secret actions will have to be also diminished. We should understand that there is a secret hidden part of the conflict, and a lot of activities are not shown and are not known and are not exposed. So it will not stop. Definitely, secret services, they will continue their actions, but at least they will make it in a lesser scale. As for the main obstacle which we see on the table today, at least it's mentioned so, Bashar Assad. I'm not sure that he's ready for this burden which he has nowadays. He was prepared for ophthalmology. He learned this profession. And when you look at his face, you clearly see that he suffers and he lives hard days to day. So probably he will be ready to leave this post. Diplomats can solve this problem and find another figure, but it has to be peaceful.
Well, I mean,
peaceful time.
I mean he will leave eventually, gentlemen. He's a human being, all right? The point is here, and I think, and again, let's stress why Russia is there, because Russia is in Syria for a number of reasons. For geopolitical and national security. There are former citizens of the Soviet Union there in fighting jihad that can get back into the former Soviet states of the Soviet Union, which can, gentlemen, to be honest here, the borders are porous. Okay, they are. But
that applies to many countries. If all those countries whose people are represented in some way or the other were to militarily intervene, then I don't think it would help. Please, sorry.
I spoke to military personnel in the Khmeimim Air Base, and there's a sense of consensus amongst all of them that it is our war that we're fighting there among the Russians, because if these people are not stopped in Syria, like you said, the borders are porous, all of those people, because like I said, terrorists speak Russian, they speak English, they speak any language, in the world. All these people will come into our, southern parts of our country. So there's consensus that we are fighting our war. We must stop them there.
And there's another goal here that is very important, and it may be kind of opaque for a lot of people outside of the West, but there is a principle here. There's a principle of saving the sovereignty of Syria, because we have destruction of one country after another. And then what Russia and countries like China, they watch very closely. They've been watching very closely since 2003, watching this path of destruction in the Middle East. And there's a good reason to believe that Russia and China itself feels that it could be the subject of forced regime change, because there's nothing holding back the America's this quest for changing the world in its own image.
I think you're giving a little bit too much
credit
or power
but Peter,
to the United
look at
States.
February 22nd.
Has there ever been an official articulation of that?
When they had the forced regime change of Ukraine, then it becomes a little bit more realistic and possible. When you see what efforts that many people go to in the West with the collusion of the U.S. State Department to undermine the credibility of this government in this country, then you're not paranoid, okay? You have to be vigilant here. Watching the destruction of Ukraine, a country on this country's border, as close to Russia as England is to Scotland, okay? I mean, this really turned the opinion of a lot of people in this country that the West is not benevolent whatsoever.
Well, not a question of benevolence, though. It's a question of capabilities. And even what the United States was trying to do and NATO was trying to do in Ukraine has now come apart in many ways. I mean, so they're not all powerful, and they're not even all wise. When we talk about Obama and the U.S. government,
not all wise.
The U.S. government not having a strategy there, right? Obama is actually under a lot of pressure to do much worse things than he's doing. And if you look at the narrative and the discourse in the U.S., it's about the extremists pushing Obama and attacking him for being too weak.
And should we be thankful?
Yes, because it could be worse.
What about those 10,000 civilians that were killed in the east of Ukraine? All the kids, and I've seen all of them. I don't think they care much about what Obama or and his company is thinking about.
But in Syria, that Obama's under a lot of pressure to do even worse things than he's been doing. So there is some debate going on within. We talk about the United States. You keep talking about the United States. Well, there's a lot of different views in the United States and different factions. There's a neocon faction. We mentioned Lindsey Graham before. And Lindsey Graham and John McCain want to bomb everybody they can.
Yes. The less said, the better.
They can bomb us.
I think they're a more moderate version of Donald Trump.
In some ways, they're even more extreme than Donald Trump.
No, but you see, I think we are going around in circles here. The point is, I think this presents a wonderful opportunity to deal with many situations in one go. Firstly, I think I don't completely buy your argument of Russian insecurity. Russia is too powerful a country to be worried that America will destabilize it using these quote-unquote pro-democracy groups.
Take a look at a map and see how many NATO bases surround Russia. Okay.
So another point of polite disagreement. but I think the bigger justification should be that this is the greatest humanitarian crisis since the Second World War. Yeah. Mm-hmm. In terms of the sheer number of 20+ million people displaced, half the population of a country displaced. So there is a genuine need to go in. And I think in terms of realpolitik, and I'd like to bounce this off you, what Putin also realizes is Obama's own allies, America's own allies, against the ISIS are also the weak link in the American effort. And that brings us back to the question of where is the money coming from. It is no secret that the ISIS receives a significant amount of funding from private financiers, I think in Kuwait and in Saudi Arabia, both of which are major allies of the US. So the US has not done enough to bear down on the allies on that issue for funding that's coming from their own countries. I believe you cut the cash tap, you might be able to handle the situation better. I'd like some of you to maybe address that. What do you think?
Qatar and Pakistan, don't forget them.
Pakistan has no money to give, but it receives money for funding terrorists.
They have a wonderful network for collecting money from population. And population is quite big-hearted.
But Pakistan is the greatest weak link of the Americans, and they've known it for the longest time. The greatest irony is talk about democracy. And on the other hand, you give royal treatment to the Pakistan army chief and treat him like a head of state when he visited
Or you listen to the
US.
House of Riyadh talking about the democratic rights of the people in Syria. I mean, this is ridiculous, all right? No,
I want to go back to the question of money. How are you going to cut
I raise this question. I don't know, can the Americans control their allies? And I say they can't. And it's because the oil price regime, there are other American presence in the greater Middle East overall. The Saudis play a very important role there. The role of Israel as well. I mean, it's really quite remarkable that, you have the Prime Minister of Israel saying, well, every once in a while we bomb Syria. Again, everybody goes nuts about violation of sovereignty. But, the country of Syria, its sovereignty is violated every single minute that we speak here, gentlemen, here, and no one cares about it. It's about principles. It's if you don't stick to these principles here, and I think that this is one of the reasons why Russia has done this. Because like it or not, we don't need to see this country destroyed, because it'll create a cascade effect to the rest of the region.
But, you're playing with kid gloves. I mean, there is one family in Kuwait, I think it's the Al-Ajmi family, which is a family of Sunni clerics, which is responsible for everything from buying and smuggling arms. They have acknowledged it on behalf of the Al-Nusra in the past. They are the source of funds. They are fundraising for all kinds of jihadist groups that are operating in Syria. And America is allowing it under its nose. So I think, preaching is one thing.
No, they have the money. The Americans give the weapons. I mean, this is a relationship. It's not overlooking something. It's a relationship.
So that's the core issue. How do we deal with that? Who will build pressure on America for that?
Well, again, and I think it's getting back to that, both the principle you're talking about and the issues of sovereignty. We have got to have pressure to put this within the umbrella of the United Nations and let other countries have their say, coming together as a coalition, and not just to go in and join militarily, because this isn't just about going in and attacking another state. It's about sharing a strategy to stop this hostility and hatred among so much of the Muslim world toward the West.
I still think the U.S. thinks it can win. That's the problem.
By Donald Trump saying that no more Muslims in the United States?
There's as long as they don't get the outcome they want, they will let it continue. That's the terrifying truth here, gentlemen. If they don't get what they want, they will keep fueling it on.
The terrifying truth is that the military-industrial complex in America will constantly need a war. And hence, all this conversation we are having about the dual standards on terror is something I think not lost on the Americans, but they need to move from one war to the other. And this should be a wake-up call for the consequences of that.
That's a really interesting phrase here, because I think it's completely lost on most Americans, absolutely. No. And it's intentionally done. It's intentionally done. I mean, ever since we go back to Iraq, everyone the U.S. doesn't like in the world is a new Hitler. He's a Hitler. He's a Hitler. He's a Hitler. And that kind of rhetoric, I mean, you know, that's one of the things that I find truly disturbing about how the West treats Russia. Once you call the elected leader of Russia Hitler, how do you sit down and talk? How do you negotiate what's good for the world? Well, how do you negotiate what's good for both countries? I mean, this for me is once we get to this level of rhetoric here, then it breaks down completely. Look what happened to Professor Stephen Cohen for even trying to look at the Russian perspective here on world issues here, and he's just demonized.
But I think somewhere this time their back is bent, the Americans, because they realize with the Russian involvement in what is happening, they are going to have to seek greater international cooperation to deal with the problem of the Islamic State. So maybe this is the point of inflection, Peter. Maybe this is the moment when you can actually get America to sit on the table
Assad will
and
be
negotiate.
in power when Barack Obama leaves office.
Exactly. So is this the inflection point then? Peter, what do you think?
Well, I'm closer to you on this than I am to Peter, and I'm more optimistic. And I think that the military-industrial complex in the United States likes wars, of course, but they do just fine even when we're not involved in a war. Their profit margins are out of control. And so they'll still be selling arms. They'll still be getting a disproportionate amount. They'll still be fearful. Because the thing about defeating ISIS is that we can defeat them militarily, but that's not going to stop the next ISIS.
That's true.
And the next ISIS.
Agreed.
And the next ISIS.
Agreed.
I mean, what we have to deal with is get at more of the kind of underlying root issues that's causing this kind of global unemployment, alienation, a bad kind of radicalization. Back in the 70s, when the Soviet Union was still serving as a model, an inspiration for radicalized youth, people around the world, I mean, they were channeling into something much more positive. Now it's channeled into this religious extremism because there's no other alternative. We've seen other very disappointing developments. We've seen the move to the right across Europe. And Portugal's an example that hasn't gone that direction, but most countries have. We've seen the defeat of the government in Argentina, Venezuela. We're seeing a rightward shift in the United States also. We look what these Republicans are. We've never seen anything like this. You know, it's not just Trump. You know, Trump's getting 36% support, but coming right behind him are Cruz and then Carson. I mean, they're all extremists. These are all people to the right. You look at a George H.W. Bush.
You're optimistic. And you're optimistic.
I'm not optimistic within the United States. I'm optimistic in the global sense. But not in terms of the way things are going now. But we have to stop that because we're losing ground.
It's so interesting. Every conversation nowadays is unfinished without Donald Trump. Talking about Donald Trump, I don't know what's more embarrassing, Donald Trump himself or the support he's getting. Well, I'd like to, we've had a wonderful chat. I think Peter, Lavelle, and I have thoroughly enjoyed it. And I'd like to thank you all very much for spending your time with us and all our viewers today. Thank you very much, and thank you, Peter.
My pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure and privilege co-hosting this with you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you.